For 10 years, I had been living with my husband, sharing a life that, at first, seemed promising and full of hope. In the early days, everything felt right. Our connection, though not passionate, was steady and reliable. We settled into our roles, built a home, and soon, our family grew with the arrival of our children. But as time passed, something subtle yet unmistakable began to shift between us. It was his coldness that crept in first. At the beginning, I hardly noticed it, chalking it up to the natural ebbs and flows of a long-term relationship. Yet, gradually, the distance between us became undeniable. We stopped touching, stopped laughing at little things. The silence between us deepened, and the words that once came so easily now seemed foreign. We never told each other, "I love you." It was as though those words were too intimate, too vulnerable for us to utter aloud. We hesitated, perhaps even feared, to express our feelings. We had children, of course. Their laughter filled the spaces that were growing cold between us, their needs and joys becoming the center of our lives. And for a time, it was enough. Our attention shifted towards them, and the responsibilities of parenting, of daily life, consumed us both. But the undercurrent of estrangement persisted, gnawing at me in quiet moments, like a shadow I couldn't quite chase away. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself that this was simply what happened in marriages, that the initial warmth and passion always cooled with time. But with every passing day, his detachment grew more pronounced. He often retreated to his mother's house, which was nearby, leaving me alone with my thoughts, my insecurities. I didn't understand why he sought her company so much, why he spent hours there while I waited at home, craving even the smallest sign that he still cared. Our arguments, once rare, now erupted with alarming frequency. And they were always about the same things: my character, my flaws, his withdrawal. The worst were his cutting remarks. He would tell me, almost casually, that I was getting old, that soon I'd be useless and unwanted. Those words stung in ways I never imagined, chipping away at what little self-confidence I had left. I started to feel invisible in my own home, as though my worth had diminished with time, just as the spark in our relationship had faded. It was as if I no longer existed to him, except as a reminder of everything he seemed to disdain. We lived next door to his mother, and it seemed as though her house had become his refuge, a place he would disappear to with increasing frequency. At first, I didn't think much of it. After all, she was his mother, and it was only natural that he would want to spend time with her. But as the years passed, it became clear that his visits weren't merely about family ties. They were an escape from me, from us, from the quiet tension that had settled over our home. Our arguments, once about trivial matters, now revolved around deeper, more personal issues. He would criticize my character, accusing me of being difficult, too emotional, too demanding. I was always too much or not enough, depending on his mood. He would remind me of my shortcomings, as though my very nature was something to be corrected. And the more we argued, the more I felt the walls closing in around me, trapping me in a marriage that was beginning to feel like a series of battles I couldn't win. In recent years, the cruelty in his words intensified. He no longer hid his disdain behind carefully chosen phrases. Instead, his remarks cut straight to the heart of my insecurities. He would tell me, with a cold, detached certainty, that I was growing old, that I was no longer desirable, and that soon I would be of no use to anyone. Those words landed like sharp blows, each one deepening the cracks that had already begun to form in my self-esteem. It wasn't just the insults, but the way he said them, as if they were facts he had long since accepted, and that I should too. He made me feel as though my value had expired, that I was slowly fading into irrelevance before his eyes. There was no affection left between us, only the remnants of what once was, and even that felt like a distant memory. I couldn't recognize the man I had married anymore, and worse, I was beginning to lose sight of myself. Through the faceless anonymity of the internet, I found someone, a man who seemed to understand me in ways I hadn't felt understood for years. Our connection was immediate, like a lifeline in the vast, lonely ocean of my existence. In him, I discovered an escape from the weight of my everyday life, a secret refuge where I could shed the burdens of my crumbling marriage and the constant sense of inadequacy that had begun to define me. What began as harmless conversations, filled with laughter and the flirtation of two strangers, quickly deepened into something far more intimate. Our affair lasted for several years, though it was marked by the infrequent nature of our meetings. The distance between us, both physical and emotional, somehow made the bond feel even more intense. The stolen moments, the fleeting texts, the rare encounters, they all seemed charged with a passion and intensity that I hadn't felt in so long. For the first time in years, I felt seen, desired, alive. It was as though I had stepped into a parallel existence, where the weight of my responsibilities and the emotional isolation of my marriage didn't follow me. He became my solace, my secret joy, and for a time, I believed that what we had was real. I told myself that he loved me, that in him, I had found the affection and attention I so desperately craved. My heart was torn between two worlds, the world of my family, where my husband and children depended on me, and this hidden world where I felt, for once, like I was enough. The guilt gnawed at me, but I continued to live in the divide, unable to fully leave either life behind. But as time passed, the fantasy began to wear thin. The rare meetings, once exhilarating, became hollow, and I started to see the cracks in the illusion I had built. The love I thought he had for me was perhaps nothing more than infatuation, and the security I felt in his presence was fleeting, dissolving the moment we parted. Slowly, a painful realization dawned on me. The life I was living with him, though intoxicating, was not sustainable. It wasn't real. It was a fleeting escape, not the foundation of anything lasting. Eventually, the clarity I had been avoiding for so long could no longer be denied. My life was with my husband and my children, no matter how broken or imperfect that life had become. They were my reality, my responsibility, and, in their own way, still my deepest connection to the world. I knew I had to let go of the affair, to close that chapter of my life in order to face what remained of my marriage. The time had come to reconcile with the truth I had been running from. My family, despite its flaws, was all that truly mattered. In an attempt to salvage what was left of my marriage, I made the difficult decision to cut ties with the other man. It wasn't easy, letting go of the one source of comfort I had found outside the suffocating walls of my home. Yet, deep down, I knew that if there was any chance of restoring my family, I had to leave that part of my life behind. The longing I felt for love and attention could no longer be fulfilled by anyone else. It had to come from within my marriage, or not at all. As I distanced myself from the affair, my thoughts turned increasingly toward my husband. I wanted to fix things, to bridge the growing chasm between us, but the years of resentment, bitterness, and unspoken pain made it difficult to imagine how we could find our way back to each other. His coldness, the hurtful words he had spoken, calling me old, telling me I was unwanted, still lingered in my mind, festering like a wound that refused to heal. Yet despite it all, I wanted to believe there was something left between us, some spark of what had once been. Desperation can lead to strange places. In my heart, I wanted to reconnect with him, to find a way back to the life we had built together, however fractured it had become. But reason and logic seemed to fail me. I wasn't sure if I could mend our relationship through words and actions alone. And so, in a moment of weakness, I turned to something irrational, something that seemed absurd even as I considered it. I decided to try a love spell. I had heard whispers of such things, of rituals that could supposedly reignite passion or bring harmony back into a broken home. It felt foolish, but at the same time, I was willing to grasp at anything, however far-fetched, if it meant having a chance to heal our marriage. I found someone who claimed to have the knowledge I needed, a woman who promised me that through a series of rituals and incantations, I could open my husband's heart again, make him see me as he once had. Looking back, I can hardly believe I went through with it. But at the time, I was driven by a desperation so deep it clouded my judgment. The spell was meant to create a bond between us, to bring his love back to the surface. I followed every instruction, every strange gesture, hoping that this act would somehow undo the years of distance and silence. But reality doesn't bend so easily. When my husband discovered the affair, everything unraveled. What had been a fragile, unspoken tension between us erupted into chaos. The peaceful, if distant, routine of our household gave way to daily arguments that seemed to flare up over the smallest things. At first, the silence was broken by bitter words, accusations, and raised voices. He couldn't contain his anger, and I couldn't defend myself. I had no excuses left. Each day brought a new conflict, each one more exhausting than the last, and our home became a battleground. In the midst of this turmoil, there came a point where we were both too tired to fight any longer. After the storm of rage and recrimination had passed, we found ourselves sitting in the quiet aftermath, confronted by the need to understand how we had come to this place. The shouting gave way to something deeper: a need to talk, to unravel the web of misunderstandings and pain that had built up over the years. It was not easy. Each word felt like it was pulled from the depths of a wound that had long festered beneath the surface. One evening, after yet another heated argument had finally run its course, we sat down in the living room, exhausted. I don't know what made him open up, but something shifted. Perhaps it was the fatigue of fighting, or perhaps, for the first time in years, we were ready to truly hear each other. Slowly, haltingly, we began to discuss how we had arrived at this crisis. He revealed things I had never known, truths that both startled and saddened me. I had believed, for so long, that he didn't care for me, that the love between us had faded and died over the years. His coldness, the lack of affection, the absence of those simple words of love I so desperately craved, all of it had convinced me that I was unloved, unwanted. Yet, as he spoke, I realized how wrong I had been. He admitted that he had loved me all these years. He loved me still. His heart had never turned away from me, but he had been raised to believe that love was something to be shown through actions, not words. To him, providing for the family, staying by my side, being there for our children, those were the ways he had expressed his feelings, even if I had never seen it that way. He had thought I understood, that I felt the same, but my silence had been as bewildering to him as his had been to me. I was stunned. For so long, I had assumed that his distance was a sign of indifference or even contempt. I thought that the spark we once had was long gone. But now, as he spoke of his love, unspoken, but ever present, I realized how blind I had been. My affair had not been born from a lack of feeling on his part, but from my own misinterpretation of his silence. I had been seeking affection and validation in another, when all along, the love I craved had been right in front of me. This revelation shattered everything I had believed about our marriage. I hadn't expected it. I had prepared myself for him to say that he no longer cared, that the years of growing apart had extinguished whatever love we once shared. But now, hearing that he still held those feelings, I was left grappling with the weight of my betrayal. I had turned away, seeking solace elsewhere, while he had remained steadfast, quietly loving me in his own way. He hired a lawyer, a ruthless professional who quickly gathered all the necessary evidence to support his case in court, aiming to strip me of my parental rights in the event of our inevitable divorce. The realization of what I had done, of how deeply I had wounded him, weighed heavily on me, but nothing compared to the thought of losing my children. It was a punishment too unbearable to contemplate, a consequence far greater than I had ever imagined when I first allowed myself to stray. I found myself alone, utterly abandoned by those I once considered my closest allies. Friends who had once listened to my complaints about my husband's coldness now avoided me, and even my own family had turned their backs. My mother, whose love I had always counted on, spoke only of disappointment, her voice cold and distant the last time we spoke. There was no comfort left, no one willing to offer a kind word or even a gesture of understanding. I had betrayed not only my husband, but the very foundations of trust that once bound my world together, and now I was paying the price. I felt the walls closing in, suffocating me in the silence that followed my confession. The realization of my actions struck me with full force: the affair, the lies, the recklessness that had destroyed everything I held dear. My love for my children was all that remained untainted, and yet, even that bond was now at risk of being severed. The thought of losing them, of being shut out of their lives, haunted my every waking moment. I couldn't bear the idea of not being there to watch them grow, to be the mother they needed, even if I had failed them in the past. Desperation took hold, a gnawing fear that consumed me, leaving me willing to do anything, anything at all, to stay in their lives. I knew I had made a terrible mistake, an unforgivable one, perhaps, but the depth of my regret was overwhelming. Every decision I had made now felt like a series of missteps leading me to this moment, and I couldn't help but wonder if there was any way to turn back, to make amends. How could I ever regain my husband's trust after shattering it so completely? Was there even a path to redemption for someone who had caused such pain? In my despair, I clung to the faint hope that somehow, through sheer determination, I might be able to repair what I had broken. But where could I begin? How does one restore trust when the very foundation of it has been so thoroughly destroyed? I replayed the events over and over in my mind, searching for an answer, for a way to fix what seemed irreparable. The guilt was relentless, a constant weight pressing down on me. The questions swirled in my mind endlessly. How could I convince him that I had changed, that I was no longer the woman who had betrayed him? What could I possibly say or do to prove my remorse was real, to show him that I would do anything to make it right? Even if he could never forgive me, could I at least show him that I was still worthy of being in our children's lives? In my desperation, I searched endlessly for a way to regain my husband's trust. Every conversation I initiated about my remorse, every tearful plea to show that I was ready to change, was met with a wall of indifference. He no longer saw me as the woman he had once married. In his eyes, I was nothing more than a betrayer. Words, I soon realized, had lost their power. I could no longer talk my way out of this mess. What he needed, what he demanded without saying a word, were actions. It became painfully clear that only deeds could speak now, and they would have to be louder than any apology I could offer. I made a bold decision, one he never would have expected from me. I dismissed my lawyer, surrendering any notion of fighting for what I thought was mine. Instead, I presented him with an offer to divide our assets and agree to custody arrangements under his terms without protest. I wanted no battle, no courtroom drama. All I wanted was for him to see how much our children meant to me and to show that I was willing to sacrifice anything to maintain that connection. It was a risky gamble, but it was the only move left to me. I had to show him that I wasn't clinging to what was lost for my own sake, but for the sake of our children, for the possibility of something, anything left to save. As I packed my things, preparing to leave the home we had shared for so many years, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The tension that had clung to me like a shadow for months seemed to lift, though only briefly. I was ready to accept the consequences of my choices, no matter how painful. But just as I was steeling myself for this new chapter, something unexpected happened. Out of the blue, my former lover, the man with whom I had cut all ties, appeared at my door. His eyes were filled with longing, his voice thick with emotion as he declared that he could not live without me. He promised me a fresh start, a new home, a new life far away from the wreckage of my marriage. He spoke of escape, of love, of a future without the weight of the past dragging me down. For a moment, it seemed like salvation, an easy way out, an opportunity to flee from the shattered remains of my life and start again with someone who, it seemed, still cared for me. But something inside me had shifted. As I stood there, listening to his impassioned pleas, I felt a sense of finality wash over me. The promise of a new life no longer held the allure it once did. I was tired, exhausted from the lies, from living two lives, from constantly seeking happiness in places that only left me more broken. Running away, starting over with him, felt like a continuation of the same pattern that had led me to this disaster. I no longer wanted to escape. What I truly wanted, what I had been too afraid to admit to myself, was the life I had already built. Despite the ruins that lay before me, despite the pain and betrayal that now defined my marriage, what I longed for was my family, my children. They were the only thing that still mattered, the only thread connecting me to a sense of purpose. I didn't want to chase after fleeting happiness any longer. I wanted to fight for the fragments of the life I had, even if it seemed impossible to repair. I turned to my lover, his words still hanging in the air, and I gently told him that I couldn't leave. Not because I didn't believe in his promises or because I doubted his sincerity, but because I no longer wanted to run. I was done with hiding, done with seeking solace in someone else's arms. The only place I needed to be was with my children, even if that meant facing the consequences of my actions head-on. In that moment, I knew there would be no easy fix, no quick path to redemption. But I had made my choice, and it was time to face whatever came next. I refused him. The decision weighed heavily on me, but I had chosen a path that, though steeped in pain and suffering, seemed the only one that led to redemption. It wasn't a choice born of strength, but of necessity. When I finally told my husband that I was leaving and agreed to all of his terms, there was a moment where he seemed not to understand. For the first time in years, I saw not anger in his eyes, but confusion. He had expected resistance from me, perhaps a desperate attempt to hold on, to fight for what was slipping away. But instead, I let go. I surrendered, and in doing so, I think I gave him something he had never expected: freedom. The weeks that followed were like moving through fog. We lived apart, and the children stayed with him. The house, once filled with the noise and chaos of family life, now echoed with silence. I would wake up to an empty home, every room a reminder of what I had lost, every moment a reflection of my mistakes. I had no clear direction, no certainty about what the future held, but one thing was painfully clear: I had to prove my love for my children not through words or promises, but through my actions. Even if that meant losing them, even if it meant I had to step away from their lives for a time, I was willing to do whatever it took to show that I was still their mother, still capable of doing what was right. During those long, lonely days, I tried to occupy myself with mundane tasks, but my mind would always drift back to them. I thought of the small, everyday moments, the laughter, the bedtime stories, the simple joy of watching them grow. These memories had become bittersweet, tainted by the knowledge that I might not be there to experience them anymore. And yet, it was this very realization that steeled my resolve. I had to prove, above all else, that I could be trusted again. Not by pleading or begging, but by showing I was willing to endure the consequences of my actions, no matter how harsh they were. My husband, though he remained distant, allowed me to see the children occasionally. Each visit was like a lifeline, brief but filled with meaning. The way they looked at me had changed, though. I could sense their confusion, perhaps even a budding sense of betrayal, though they were too young to fully understand. But still, they hugged me with the same warmth, and in those moments, I felt the faintest glimmer of hope. I realized that this journey toward redemption wasn't about winning my husband back or proving anything to the world. It was about rebuilding something far more important: the trust between myself and my children. And that would take time, more time than I had ever imagined. But I was prepared to wait. I was prepared to be patient, to stand by from the sidelines if that's what it took, knowing that one day, perhaps, they would see that everything I was doing was for them. The hardest part was not knowing how long this limbo would last. Every day was a question mark, a test of endurance. I often wondered if my husband could ever truly forgive me, if he could ever see past the hurt I had caused. But that was no longer the question that kept me awake at night. Now, all that mattered was the bond with my children, the bond one had nearly destroyed, but was determined to mend. Even if it meant giving them space to heal, even if it meant being apart for a while, I was willing to do whatever it took to show them that I hadn't given up on them, and that I never would. And then, one day, he came to me. There were no lawyers, no papers, no threats hanging in the air. He stood there, quiet and composed, yet there was something different in his eyes, something I hadn't seen in what felt like years. It wasn't anger or resentment, but a kind of weariness, as though he, too, had grown tired of the constant battle we'd been waging against each other. He took a deep breath and said, "I don't want to take the children away from you. Maybe we need to try to start over, though I know rebuilding trust will be the hardest part." His words hung in the air between us, like a fragile bridge spanning the distance that had grown between us over time. I was stunned. For so long, I had expected nothing but bitterness from him, especially after everything I had done. But here he was, standing in front of me, offering something I hadn't dared hope for: a chance. Not a promise, not a guarantee that things would go back to the way they once were, but a sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, there was still something worth saving between us. I didn't know what to say at first. My heart was racing, torn between relief and fear. Relief because this could be the beginning of healing, not just for us, but for our children, who deserved more than the broken home we had given them. Fear because I knew how fragile this moment was, how easily everything could still fall apart. What if we couldn't find our way back to each other? What if the damage we had caused was too deep to repair? But despite the uncertainty, I realized I couldn't let fear guide me. I had already spent too much time running from the truth, hiding behind lies and poor decisions. Now, in this moment, with him standing before me, I understood that this was my chance, perhaps the only chance, to begin to make things right. "I don't know how to start," I finally said, my voice trembling. "I don't know if we can ever be what we were before, but I want to try. I'll do whatever it takes to rebuild the trust one destroyed." He nodded, but there was a sadness in his eyes, as if he knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. "It won't be easy," he replied, "and I can't promise that everything will be the same. But for the children, and maybe for ourselves, we owe it to them, and to us, to try." In that moment, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It wasn't the bright, blinding hope of new love or the certainty of a happy ending. It was quieter, more fragile, like the first glimmer of dawn after a long, dark night. But it was hope nonetheless, and that was more than I had dared to dream of. I knew we had a long way to go, and there would be days when the weight of our past would feel unbearable. There would be moments when the wounds we had inflicted on each other would reopen, and we'd have to face the pain all over again. But standing there, looking into his eyes, I realized that for the first time in what felt like forever, we were both willing to try. We weren't clinging to the past anymore, but looking to the future, uncertain as it was. Maybe we would never be the same as we once were. Maybe our relationship would be different, shaped by the trials we had endured and the mistakes we had made. But in that difference, there was also the possibility of something new, something stronger, forged in the fire of our shared suffering and our mutual desire to heal. And so, with tentative steps, we began the journey toward rebuilding. It wasn't a clean slate, and it never would be, but it was a chance. A chance for redemption, for growth, for the possibility of a future where forgiveness could take root. Whether or not we succeeded didn't matter in that moment. What mattered was that we were both willing to try. And in that willingness, I found a glimmer of peace, knowing that no matter what lay ahead, we had both chosen to face it together.